If you haven't watched the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, you really should. That's if you want a history lesson, that is. Look, we did get some interesting information from within all the fluff, but be warned, Putin likes to open any discussion with a rundown of Russia and Ukraine's history, and it's very much from Russia's perspective. So let's break it down in as short and sweet a way that we can for you. This time looking at it from a different perspective. Putin likes to skate over some of the more unsavory parts of Russian history. He's been adamant that Russia always treated its neighbors well, even after conquering them, and that even in medieval times, Russia cherished the countries that they absorbed. That's not exactly true. Look, a few hundred years ago, a small thing like human rights violations weren't exactly at the top of anyone's priority list. Admitting that war 500 years ago was a brutal and horrific affair isn't exactly going to change anything. That's true of every country on planet Earth. People have always done hideous things to each other, denying that truth only paints him as a propagandist. Obviously, he wants to paint Russia in the best light possible, but to what end? Anyway, the back and forth between Russia and Ukraine has been going on since the 13th century. It came to a head between the 1920s all the way to the end of WW2. Ukraine was desperate to get out of Russian rule, and the dissatisfaction even led to a civil war at one point. But it was all for nothing. At the end of the Great War, Ukraine was once again under Russian rule. And this time, Russia took some pretty harsh steps to impose their dominance. At one point, the Ukrainian language was banned, and only Russian was taught in schools. But Ukraine wasn't in any position to argue. Ravaged by war and sorely in need of infrastructure so that their people could have roofs over their heads, Russia did at least help rebuild the country, but that support came at a price. If any aid was going to be given, they made it pretty clear that it was going to be on Russia's terms. Look, they didn't just take Ukraine. Russia had every intention to absorb about half of Europe if they managed to get enough power, but those counties each have a story of their own, and that's another video entirely. The Cold War set in, with the capitalist countries buddying up together to form NATO, while the communist counties made their own alliances to form the Warsaw Pact Alliance. But as we know, the USSR collapsed, and all of those territories it claimed before and during WW2 took the opportunity to get out from under their communist overlord. 15 countries all declared independence in the late 80s and early 90s, overthrowing their communist governments. Almost everyone surrounding Russia broke away and joined NATO. And their new NATO allies helped them to rebuild and assisted the transition into the European market. Russia was nervous as hell about this. The unbroken line between NATO countries and Russia was the longest it had ever been, and if they lost more ground, well then, from a military standpoint, they'd lose some very valuable territory, making them vulnerable to attack. And the sudden influx of countries throwing the Soviet Union and its policies aside for the European capitalist system was, well, alarming. Soon, only Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine remained under Soviet rule. Russia was weakened and in no position to stop the sudden uprisings and declarations of independence. NATO and the Allied forces were just too happy to help these nations to get back on their feet. So Russia faced two problems. For one thing, they believed that any country who had ever fallen under the Russian canopy will always belong there, no matter what the people or the West had to say about it. Call it stubbornness or an older brother keeping his family together, it doesn't really matter. Russia wanted its siblings back. And secondly, this was a disastrous extension of the West's power, with only Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine still remaining. This put Russia's borders in serious jeopardy. Tactically speaking, losing the last three remaining allies would be a death sentence if Russia ever had to face a war with the West. So Russia did what they did best, reinforce their hold with force. Now Ukraine specifically was in no position to fight back, They desperately needed the infrastructure and support of Russia to rebuild after centuries of war. If they were going to survive in the new age, then they needed all the help they could get. But the common people didn't agree. To them, their culture, language, and independence was more important, and the increasing stress of the Russian Empire upon them was suffocating. The Ukrainian government became a NATO partner in 1994, with every intention of joining officially. But Russia at first kept this at bay by threatening to pull their money and support. That only worked for a little while. Russia made it very clear, join NATO and cozy up to Europe, and Russia was going to react, come hell or high water. The situation bubbled under the surface for a few more years until Ukraine attempted to sign an agreement with the EU in 2013, just a year after Putin began his run as president of Russia. With Russian influence, the Ukrainian government, which was more pro-Russian leaning at the time, pulled out of the deal. Ukrainian citizens marched out into the streets demanding that they join the EU, but they were met with Ukrainian military heavily funded by Russia. This led to the deaths of over 100 protesters. But Ukraine rose up again with hundreds of thousands of people demanding change. This time the people were more successful. They sent their president running for the hills. He fled the country in fear of his life. Putin had lost the support of the nation completely now, so he stepped into the fray with the Russian flag officially and openly entering the battle. He took Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk, making them independent states under Russian rule. For the next decade, Putin kept interfering in elections, and he kept an armed military force on the borders at all times. The intimidation tactic didn't work for very long. He constantly had Ukrainian protests and militant groups attempting to form to overthrow their government. Putin was adamant: comply with Russian demands and live by our rule, and no further steps will be taken. But join NATO and weaken the border, and there will be a reaction. Putin likes spinning a narrative. For one, he claims that the military force present in Ukraine since the 90s is to keep neo-Nazi groups from taking over. Now, he's not totally wrong about Ukraine having a rather disturbing history of anti-Semitism. Heck, most of Ukraine happily joined Hitler back in WW2, and these groups still exist to this day. But Putin is blowing the situation out of proportion. Ukraine, like almost every country in the world, has its racists and ultra-conservative, even militant underground. But if the Ukrainian people were willing to vote for Zelensky, who is of Jewish descent, is the problem really as monumental as Putin paints it to be? Almost certainly not. But the man will use anything at his disposal to justify an invasion before Ukraine joined NATO officially. And that's exactly where Zelensky was heading. He wanted to take Ukraine out of the Soviet umbrella completely and join with the rest of Europe. And the people of Ukraine, after years of protests and bloodshed, were all for the shift. Putin couldn't lose another country to the West, especially not the biggest protection to its borders, or a place that supplies Europe with most of its grain. He hadn't been keeping the country unstable for all this time, just so they could start going out on their own. Putin needs the border protected and the grain supply under his thumb. Losing those means that Russia loses even more ground. And the past 100 years haven't exactly held a lot of wins on the Russian front. So in November 2021, Russia invaded, under the guise of fighting neo-Nazi racists and keeping their little brother within the family, the brother who has always been, by their opinion, part of Russia. But in truth, Russia needs Ukraine to keep the buffer between them and the West intact, and they need to keep control of the grain, since it's one of the very few power plays they have to keep Europe on their toes. The funny thing is, if Russia actually allowed Ukraine the freedom they wanted and gave them the support they needed to be an independent nation, then Ukraine would have probably kept their ties with Russia on friendly terms. But instead, Russia decided to subjugate with force by taking away the rights and the wishes of the people who actually had to live under those conditions. They thought that keeping the country unstable would make them easy to control. If they'd taken a different route, well, there probably wouldn't be a war today that's taken 15,000 lives and displaced millions. So we'll leave you with this. If Russia does manage to take Ukraine out from European influence, will they truly leave the nations that used to be under their rule alone? Or like in the past, will they continue to annex the nations that they believe rightfully belong to them? It's not like Putin was telling the truth when he said he wasn't going to invade Ukraine. So what's going to keep Lithuania, Georgia, Poland, and the 12 other countries that they feel belong to Russia safe? Only time will tell, but tell us what you think. And like always, subscribe, comment and share, stay informed, and stay aware. Cheers!